What if I told you that Jesus was carrying out a 1,400-year-old military offensive when he stepped out of the baptismal waters of the Jordan River? And I don't mean a metaphor. I mean a map with coordinates and named enemies from Joshua's day, a battle strategy that David used to defeat the Philistines, and a vantage point that only Moses had known before. For hundreds of years, Jesus has been depicted as a soft savior. He's even been called gentle and lowly by theologians in recent years. But at his birth, Jesus wasn't given the name of a poet or a pastor. He was given the name of one of Israel's greatest conquerors, a military strategist who was born for war. Most people don't think of Jesus' earthly ministry as a military campaign. In fact, it seemed like he was almost opposed to the idea. I mean, he told Peter to put away his sword after he cut off the Roman officer's ear. He allowed himself to be taken without struggle. We have no record of Jesus picking up any weapon, raising any army, or commissioning any military officers. So, what am I talking about when I say that Jesus was given the name of a warrior? Well, to explain what I mean, we have to go back about 1,400 years to the end of Deuteronomy and a man standing on a mountain looking across a land that he would never set foot on. Moses is 120 years old at this point. His eye still hasn't dimmed, and his strength hasn't left him despite a very long-lived life. He climbs up to the plains of Moab, up on Mount Nebo, up to the top of a ridge called Pisgah, and he stands there and he looks. God shows him everything, all of it. Gilead all the way up to Dan, Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah, clear out to the sea, the south and the plain of the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, all the way to Zoar. Every mile of it laid out in front of one old man on a mountain, in a single unbroken view no human being had ever been given before. And then God tells him this: "This is the land which I swear unto Abraham, unto Isaac, and unto Jacob, saying, I will give it unto thy seed. I have caused thee to see it with thine eyes, but thou shalt not go over thither," or over there. That's in Deuteronomy 34. You will see it, but you will not enter it. 40 years he had spent getting Israel to this exact spot. 40 years of manna and complaining and a bronze snake on a pole and a rock that he struck when he wasn't supposed to. And then here at the very edge, at the very last mountain, God lets him look at the whole thing and then closes the door in front of him. Moses dies right there on that mountain, buried in a valley in Moab in an unmarked grave nobody has ever found. We know that from Deuteronomy 34. There's also a hint elsewhere of a battle over Moses' body, his bones, between the powers of darkness and the powers of light. And then the man who takes his place, the one who actually gets to walk into that land and starts taking it, that man's name is Joshua. In Hebrew, his name is Yeshua, the same name a virgin in Nazareth would be told to give her son 1,400 years later. So here's what I'm actually telling you. I want to be plain about this right now. 1,400 years after Moses stood on that mountain and got told no, a man carrying his successor's name walks down into a river. John's already standing there in the water on the eastern bank. Jesus wades out to him and gets baptized. And the moment he comes up out of that water, the Spirit doesn't lead him gently into ministry. It drives him straight out into the wilderness. And he's out there for 40 days. 40 years for Moses, wandering with an entire nation. 40 days for Jesus, wandering alone. And at the end of those 40 days, the devil takes him up onto a mountain. Matthew just calls it an exceeding high mountain, but doesn't bother naming it in Matthew chapter 4. And once they're up there, Satan shows him all the kingdoms of the world and the glory of them, every single one of them laid out in one sweeping view, the same kind of panorama that God once gave Moses of the promised land from the same mountaintop centuries before. And then comes the offer from Satan. "All these things will I give thee," Satan says, "if thou wilt just fall down and worship me." Moses stood on a mountain, saw the land laid out in front of him, and was told he couldn't have it. Jesus stands on that same mountain and sees the same land, plus a whole lot more, it seems, laid out right in front of him. He's told that he can have it right now, today, without fighting, without waiting. Nothing required except bowing down to the one making the offer. And Jesus' answer is no. It's not the kind of rejection that ends the confrontation, though. It's the kind that escalates the conflict, because the next thing that Jesus does is he walks out of that wilderness, crosses back over the Jordan from east to west, just like Joshua did, and starts heading straight for the exact ground Moses was never allowed to enter. That's the campaign that I'm talking about. It's not a metaphor, like I said earlier. It's not spiritual feelings. It's an actual physical march into a land that had names and borders and enemies still ruling over it. Land that Joshua was supposed to finish taking 1,400 years earlier, but he never did. And speaking of that land, I've got a pretty big announcement at the end of this video, so stick around for that. Quick heads up before I keep going here. I was putting some finishing touches on this video, and I realized that I need to explain something. I'm going to be making a lot of connections in this video between the Old and the New Testament. That's really what this entire video is about, the connections between what's going on in the Old Testament and what's going on with Jesus in the New Testament. A lot of these connections are old hat, old ground that people have walked before, but there are some new connections in this video that I don't think that anybody has made before, or at least I haven't been able to find anybody making these connections. I've looked online, I've looked in some of my books, I've looked in some of the academic libraries that I have access to. I can't find them. First, let's go back through everything I just told you because I don't want you to take my word for it. I want to show you the actual verses behind every connection that I just made because it's all right there in the Bible. Start with the name because that one's the easiest to check and most people have genuinely never really noticed. Joshua and Jesus are the same name in Hebrew, Yeshua. And the King James translators made it clear. This is one of the things I like about the King James translation. They actually call Joshua Jesus in the New Testament, and that happens twice. First, there's Stephen's sermon in Acts chapter 7. The translators render Joshua as Jesus in the King James. Then the book of Hebrews does the exact same thing in chapter 4. The King James is a funny book in that way. Now, the 40 years and the 40 days, they're not the same, obviously, they just have the same number. But I'm not reading that into the Bible either. The Bible connects those two numbers itself a long time before Jesus ever gets born. When the 12 spies go up into the land and then they come back with their report and Israel refuses to go in because of the giants and they say that they're like grasshoppers to them, God tells them exactly how their punishment is going to be measured out. And he does it by tying it straight back to the days those spies went scouting. Numbers 14 says, "After the number of the days in which ye searched the land, even 40 days, each day for a year shall ye bear your iniquities, even 40 years." That's in Numbers chapter 14. 40 days of scouting becomes 40 years of wandering, hundreds of years before Matthew ever writes about Jesus in the wilderness. Now, let's compare the two mountains next to each other, because this is a claim that goes against the mainstream understanding of where Jesus' temptation took place. On Nebo, in the Old Testament, it says, "The Lord showed him all the land." That's in Deuteronomy 34, verses 1 through 3. On the mountain in the wilderness, the devil showed him all the kingdoms of the world and the glory of them. That's the same kind of sweeping panoramic vision, the same idea of a man standing on a height and having the whole world laid out beneath him. But there's one more link. The location of Jesus' baptism is right at the foot of Mount Nebo, on the east side of the Jordan. Jesus leaving into the nearby wilderness surrounding Mount Nebo would have made sense that Jesus was then taken to Mount Nebo for the last temptation. So Jesus would have been standing in the very same place as Moses on that mountain. There's one more thing worth noticing here, though. Every answer Jesus gives the devil is a direct quote from Moses himself out of this same farewell sermon in Deuteronomy when Moses is likely writing it either on Mount Nebo or near Mount Nebo, chapters 6 and 8 in Deuteronomy. He says, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God." That's Matthew 4, and it comes from Deuteronomy chapter 8. He says, "Thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God." Also Matthew 4, that comes from Deuteronomy chapter 6. "Thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and him only shalt thou serve." That also comes from Deuteronomy chapter 6. 3 responses from Jesus quoting Moses on that same mountain. Pretty incredible to me. Moses preaches that final sermon because Israel already failed these tests once. And the second one even trips up Moses himself when he strikes that rock in anger and loses his own entry into the land. That happens in Numbers chapter 20. Jesus faces those same 3 tests and answers them in Moses' own words, but this time he's succeeding, exactly where Moses' generation and Moses himself failed. I believe that this entire scene and Jesus' responses are telling us something, giving us a hint at what to look for. And once you see it laid out like that, not only is it clear that Jesus is walking in Moses' footsteps, it also leads to the question of what he's walking toward. In the Old Testament, this is the moment of transition from Moses' mission into Joshua's conquest. Joshua takes up the mantle, takes Israel across the Jordan and into the land to take it. For Jesus, it's his transition as well, from passing the test that Israel failed to crossing the Jordan back into the land. But what I want to show you is that this is only the beginning of Jesus' passing every test and fulfilling every promise. It gets better from here. So, let's go back and look at what Joshua's own conquest actually accomplished, and more importantly, what it didn't accomplish or what he left unfinished. Look at Joshua chapter 13. We'll start here, right near the end of Joshua's life. God says something to him that rarely gets preached. God says, "Thou art old and stricken in years, and there remaineth yet very much land to be possessed." That's Joshua chapter 13, verse 1. Not well done. He doesn't say the job is finished. There is still land left, God tells him. After everything Joshua has already conquered, after Jericho, after Hazor, after the entire southern and northern campaigns most of us learned about in the Sunday school classes. And God's not being vague here either. A few verses later, God names the people specifically like a ledger of unfinished business. And then God says something incredible to me. "Them will I drive out before the children of Israel." That's in chapter 13, verse 6 of Joshua. The Sidonians, that whole northern coastal strip, what's later called Galilee, God says plainly, "I will drive them out myself." So here's the next question. Did God finish the work that Joshua left undone? Well, if you go looking for it anywhere in the rest of the Old Testament, you won't find it. Not in Joshua, not in Judges, not in Samuel or Kings. Sidon never falls. The places that later become Galilee and Capernaum and Bashan. Not once, not a single time across the entire span of Israel's history were the people removed from those places. That's strange enough on its own, in my opinion, but it actually gets stranger because just a few chapters later, Joshua 21:45 makes a sweeping claim that seems to directly contradict what we just read. It says, "There failed not aught of any good thing which the Lord had spoken unto the house of Israel. All came to pass." There failed not aught means nothing failed. And in case you think that's a one-time exaggeration or something, Joshua repeats it again in his farewell address, almost word for word in chapter 23, verse 14. So, which is it? Did God fail to keep a promise he made in Joshua 13, or did every single promise come to pass, exactly like Joshua says twice? This is where my very simple Bible study method comes in super handy. It's a 4-part framework, and it helps to make sense of tough or confusing passages just like this one in Joshua. I wrote a little book detailing the whole thing that you can get now in print or in digital format on Amazon. It's called How to Study the Bible. The link to that one, plus a few other new books that I've secretly launched this week, is in the description under the video. You can check that out. So did God keep his promise to Joshua, or did he fail? I don't think that's a contradiction that we need to explain away. You can probably guess that I think that God keeps his promises. I think it's a hint of something much bigger, a pattern. And it's exactly the thing that Jesus is shedding light on the moment he steps out of that wilderness and crosses the river where Joshua crossed. He didn't just pass the test that Israel failed. He crossed the Jordan to finish what was unfinished. So picture what's actually happening in the land after Joshua dies. Down south, things mostly get finished. Judah and Simeon push through. They take city after city, and even Caleb, an old man by now, personally clears out the giants that had terrified Israel a generation earlier. There are a couple of holdouts, like Jerusalem. It stays in enemy hands. And one valley stays out of reach because of iron chariots that Israel can't stop. But for the most part, the south gets done. Head north, though, and the story changes completely. Tribe after tribe runs into the same wall. City after city stays put. Whole regions, geographically, that were supposed to belong to Israel by promise end up belonging to Israel only on a map, not in reality, because the people there never leave. And if you were to keep a running list of every place that gets mentioned as unconquered, you'd notice something. Almost all of them are clustered in the exact same place, in the north, along the coast, and also up around the land that will one day be called Galilee. That imbalance doesn't get fixed for a long, long time. It takes centuries. It takes David to finally break the back of the Philistines as a real threat. Even the last of the giants, the ones nobody else could touch, get dealt with under David at the very end of his story. So the South does eventually get closed. The conquest in the South is finished. But the North never gets closed. Not by Joshua, not by the judges who come after him, not by Saul or David or Solomon or anyone else. The coast stays the coastal region. The region that later becomes Galilee stays Galilee of the nations, even through Isaiah's lifetime. And it's still true 1,400 years later, when the next Joshua, the man that we English speakers call Jesus, when he shows up. So why does any of this matter? Why does it matter whether a handful of Canaanite cities up north ever got conquered? I think most people assume that the whole point of the conquest was real estate, land for a landless people. And on the surface, sure, that's true. The land is important. But I don't think that's actually what the conquest was for. I think it was aimed at something underneath the land. And there are two kings early on who tell you exactly what that something was. Before Israel ever crosses the Jordan, before Joshua even takes command, Moses leads them against two kings on the east side of the river, Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, king of Bashan. And Og gets a strange little detail attached to his name that the writer clearly wants you to notice, because he stops the narrative entirely to point out one thing. He says, "Only Og, king of Bashan, remained of the remnant of giants." Deuteronomy tells us, and then almost like proof, it describes his bed, an iron bedstead over 13 feet long, kept on a display in the city of Rabbath. That's in Deuteronomy chapter 3. And those giants there, he's the remnant of the Rephaim. Sihon and Og get defeated together, remembered together, and recited together for generations afterward in the Psalms and in Israel's worship, long after anyone alive had actually seen either one of them. That's in Psalm 135 and 136. Two kings out of every king Israel ever fought get singled out that way. Scholars who study this material closely, like Heiser and N.T. Wright and Tim Mackey, they've made a case that I think is worth taking seriously. The conquest wasn't primarily about clearing out ethnic groups. It was about clearing out territory that belonged, in some very real sense, to powers that weren't human. Sihon and Og and the giant clans that stood behind them were the visible, physical edge of something spiritual sitting underneath. And if that's right, then here's what it means for everything that we just looked at. The land that Joshua never finished conquering wasn't just land nobody got around to taking. It was land where whatever those kings represented never got actually removed. So watch what happens next in the story. Because if that's true, if the land was never actually cleared of what was ruling over it, then the pattern of where Jesus goes and the things he faces once he gets there stops looking like random events of his ministry. It starts looking like a map that was handed to him from 1,400 years earlier. We'll start with Judea, because this part is easy to miss and it matters just as much as anywhere else. Jesus spends a lot of time here. He teaches in the temple, he clashes with the Pharisees, he rides in on a colt while crowds throw down their coats in front of him, he eats his last meal here, he's arrested here, he dies here. He's fully present in Judea, walking its roads and teaching in its synagogues. But in all of that time, in every account we have of him there, there's not a single recorded exorcism, not one demon cast out. People accuse him of being possessed himself down there, but nobody ever gets delivered from a demon on that ground. Judea, the southern territory, was closed 1,000 years earlier under David. And even though Jesus walks through it constantly, that's not where this particular type of battle happens. Now follow Jesus north into the region of Galilee, and the pattern flips completely. This is where Jesus sets up his home base in Capernaum, and this is where most of his exorcisms actually happen. And what's more, Galilee has a name attached to it in the scriptures that most people read right past. Isaiah calls it Galilee of the nations, sitting in darkness, waiting for a great light. That's in Isaiah chapter 9, 1 and 2. And centuries later, Matthew quotes that exact line and applies it directly to Jesus setting up shop in Capernaum. That's in Matthew 4, verses 12 through 16, if you want to look it up. Isaiah isn't picking on that region at random either, because Galilee is exactly the ground that Naphtali and Zebulun couldn't finish clearing back in the days of the judges. It's that same region that stays mixed. It stays pagan. It stays of the nations for 1,400 years. And it's that same region where a mute man gets delivered from a demon right in Jesus' own city, Matthew chapter 9, where a man convulsing in the Capernaum synagogue gets set free in front of the whole congregation. That's Mark chapter 1. Case after case, right there in Galilee, on the ground that was never finished. If you push out further, you can see that the pattern still holds. Jesus crosses over into the country of the Gadarenes, out past the Sea of Galilee, and there he meets a man possessed by so many demons they call themselves Legion. And Jesus casts out the whole host of them all at once. That's in Matthew chapter 5. That region sits right on the edge of Bashan, the same territory God named in Joshua 13 as never being properly cleared. Keep going north up towards Caesarea Philippi, and you're standing in that same general frontier, the region Joshua himself said Israel never drove out. By the way, I've got a whole video about that. It's kind of like a prequel to this one. So if you want to learn more about the details of Matthew chapters 4 and 5 and what Jesus did with the legion of demons in chapter 5, go ahead and check that one out. I've linked that one in the description under this video. So when you lay it out on a map, you get 3 rings moving outward. Galilee at the center, the closest unfinished ground where most of the activity happens. Sidon further out, where a Canaanite woman's daughter gets delivered in the exact region God named by name in Joshua 13, verse 6. And then Bashan, the furthest out. It's the old territory of the giant king himself. Every ring sits exactly on top of the ground that 1,400 years of Israel's history never touched. Jesus is traveling all over the whole region, Judea included, but the demons only come out in the places that Joshua left standing. So there's one more piece to this, and it's the piece where Jesus tells you, in his own words, what's actually happening when he does all of this. Somebody accuses Jesus of casting out demons by the power of Satan himself. They use the name Beelzebub for this. And Jesus answers with a picture instead of an argument, which is true to Jesus, isn't it? He says, how can one enter into a strong man's house and spoil his goods, except he first bind the strong man, and then he will spoil his house? A strong man guarding a house, holding everything in it hostage or taking it as his own. And the only way to take what's inside is to deal with the strong man first. Bind the strong man, and the house is yours for the taking. Jesus is explaining here in a simple story, his own method. He's saying it out loud to the Pharisees here in the middle of an argument. And it lines up with something that you already know from a much older story, one of the most famous stories in the Old Testament. When David walks out to face Goliath, nobody expects the whole war to hinge on one fight. But that's exactly what Goliath himself proposes. This is what Goliath says. If ye be able to fight with me and to kill me, then will we be your servants. Goliath shouts it across the valley. But then he says, but if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants. That's in 1 Samuel chapter 17. One champion standing in for an entire army. If you beat him, you've beaten all of them without ever having to raise a sword against the rest of the people. That's the strong man concept. David doesn't need to personally defeat every Philistine soldier in that valley. He just needs to put down the one holding the whole thing together, and the battle is over before it even really starts. That's exactly what's happening every time Jesus walks into unfinished territory and casts out a single demon. He isn't fighting the entire spiritual population of Galilee one soul at a time. He's finding the strong man holding that particular house. He binds him one region at a time, the same way that David bound the entire army of the Philistines by putting down one man in the valley of Elah. Jesus himself connects the dots on this even further later on, when the 70 disciples come back from their mission, amazed that even the demons obeyed them in Jesus' name. And Jesus' response is fascinating. He doesn't just congratulate them. He tells them what he saw while they were out there doing the exorcising. He says, I beheld Satan as lightning falling from heaven. That's in Luke chapter 10. Not one demon losing one fight. Something much bigger is going on. Satan falling every time one of these strong men gets bound. So here's where all of that actually lands for us. Moses climbed a mountain and saw a land he wasn't allowed to enter. Joshua crossed the Jordan and took most of it, but not all of it, and then died admitting that the job wasn't finished. David closed the south generations later, but the north stayed open for another 1,000 years after that. Sidon untouched, Galilee still of the nations, the old territory of the giant king still standing exactly where Moses left it. And then a man carrying Joshua's own name climbs a mountain of his own and gets offered all of it at once, the whole land, no fighting required, nothing but a moment of worship in the wrong direction. And he says no. And instead of taking the shortcut, he does it the long way, the way Joshua was supposed to do it in the first place, one region at a time, one strong man at a time, walking into the exact territory that had been sitting unclaimed since before his own ancestors set foot in it. So I'll say this again. Jesus is not living out a metaphor. He's finishing a real conquest. He's saving his people from their sins like he was prophesied to do. The sins that they let linger for over 1,000 years, and the exact ground that those sins had been allowed to take root in. I don't think that's a coincidence tucked away in the background of the Gospels for scholars to argue about. I think that's the whole point. I think it's why the very last thing that Jesus says to his disciples right before he leaves isn't, well done, or okay, you can go ahead and rest now. He gives them a commission. He says, all power is given unto me in heaven and in earth. He tells them to go ye therefore. That's in Matthew 28. The conquest doesn't end with him closing the last unfinished region of first century Israel. It ends with him handing the whole campaign to us. We live on the other side of that conquest now. The powers and principalities that ruled over the specific ground that Joshua left unbeaten have already been defeated by Jesus, bound and thrown down like lightning. But that same kind of battle is still going on all over the rest of the world, in places that have never heard the name of the one who bound it, and in a lot of places that have heard the name, rejected it, or forgotten it. We don't fight that battle the way that Joshua did either, with an army and a sword. We fight it the way that the early church did, in the power Jesus himself promised before he left. He says in Acts chapter 1, "Ye shall receive power after the Holy Ghost is come upon you, and ye shall be witnesses unto me, unto the uttermost part of the earth." That is the spiritual warfare that we are to carry forward. Every single time somebody gets pulled out of darkness and into light, every time a soul goes from death to life, from spiritually homeless to adopted into the family of God, from lost to found, that's not a metaphor either. That's the exact same conquest, the same battle, still going on, still winning, one strong man, one more soul at a time. One more. Okay, so big announcement time, like I promised. If any of this made you want to actually stand on this ground yourself, in Galilee or Capernaum or Bashan, most of the places that we've walked through today, I'm leading a group there myself next year. I'm tracing this exact map and a whole lot more for 9 days with a group of people who choose to go on this trip with me. I'll be teaching on location in a lot of the spots, eating all my meals with you and walking and talking with you the whole time. There will be a lot of walking. There's a link in the description for this trip and all the details, so go check it out. It's more than half full already. I've already told a few people about it, but I wanted to announce it more broadly to everybody to see if anybody else wanted to go. Move quickly on it because more than half of it's already filled up, and I don't think that those seats will remain open very long. Go check it out in the description. There's a link down there.